Imagine being a top CEO. Not just any CEO, but one of the most respected black entrepreneurs in the country. It's a man whose name echoes in Forbes meetings, who's spoken at Harvard Business School, and whose journey from nothing to a multi-million-dollar tech empire has inspired thousands. Now imagine that same man, flying first class like he always does, boarding a 5-hour flight from New York to Los Angeles. The airline knew him. The frequent flyer perks, the luxury lounges, the concierge emails, they were all tailored to him. He wasn't just any customer. He was elite. That man was David Carter, dressed in a sharp navy suit with a quiet, confident energy. David stepped onto flight 476 like any other day. He greeted the flight attendants with a polite nod, placed his laptop bag in the overhead bin, settled into seat 1A with a deep breath, ready to spend the flight reviewing investor reports and maybe catching up on some rest. The plane took off. The hum of the engines soon became white noise. The flight attendants began rolling out meal service, but something felt different this time. A meal that told a story her name tag said Karen. She didn't greet David the same way she did the others. While she poured champagne with a bright smile for the man in 1B, and offered a warm blanket to the couple in 2A and 2B, she barely even glanced at David. Still, he brushed it off. Maybe she was having a bad day. Then came the food. Karen placed a tray in front of him without a word. "Oh, here you go," no explanation of what was being served. Just a thud of plastic hitting the tray table. David looked down. Pasta cold. The sauce had congealed. The cheese was crusty. And worst of all, green mold bloomed across one corner of the chicken breast like fuzzy moss. He blinked. Surely this was a mistake. He watched as Karen moved on, serving fresh, steaming meals to others. Their food looked completely different: sizzling short ribs, baked salmon with sides, warm rolls. David cleared his throat and called her over politely. "Excuse me, is this supposed to be served like this?" he asked, holding up the tray. Karen glanced down, barely hiding her annoyance. "Well, sir, maybe you should have booked coach if you wanted better service," she snapped. Silence. Heads turned. The businessman in 1B looked at David, eyes wide. A lady in 3A clutched her pearls. You could hear a pin drop in that cabin. David's heart didn't race. He didn't flare up, just sat still for a second. Because in that moment, he understood exactly what was happening. The familiar stain of discrimination. David Carter had dealt with subtle racism his entire life. He'd been mistaken for the valet at a gala where he was the keynote speaker. At his own tech company, some interns had once asked him if he was the delivery guy. He was used to it, that silent bias. The invisible expectation that someone like him didn't belong in spaces like this. But on that flight, it wasn't silent. It was loud. It was public. It was cruel. Karen walked away before he could respond, moving down the aisle with robotic politeness smiles for everyone else, ignoring David like he wasn't even there. He didn't say another word. Instead, he took out his phone, quietly, discreetly. He snapped a picture of the moldy food and started recording audio, not for revenge, but for evidence, because people like him always needed proof. Without it, they'd just be called too sensitive or angry. As the flight continued, he watched Karen laugh and joke with the white passengers, offering them extra bread and drink refills. She never came back to him, not once, not even for water. He stared out the window. This wasn't just about food. It was about dignity, the twist, the passenger with power.
Ow!
What Karen didn't know was that David Carter wasn't just a rich man flying first class. He was a major shareholder in the very airline she worked for. In fact, just 8 months earlier, David's firm had invested nearly $40 million into the airline's expansion and customer experience division. He'd sat in meetings about how to improve service, especially for underrepresented travelers. And now, here he was, the victim of the very bias he had hoped to help solve. He opened his secure email app mid-flight and sent a message directly to Alicia Monroe, the airline's chief operating officer. It's David Carter on flight 476. "I've just experienced a blatant act of racial bias from your flight attendant, Karen last name. I've attached photos and audio. This isn't the first time I've seen this behavior in the skies, but it will be the last time it goes unpunished. He hit send. 10 minutes later, she responded, I am truly sorry, David. This will be handled before you even exit the airport. But David had something else in mind. He didn't just want an apology. He wanted accountability. The landing and the lesson as the plane touched down at LAX. David remained calm. He didn't rush to get his bag. He didn't look Karen's way. But Karen, now finally noticing the extra attention around David, seemed uneasy. As passengers exited, David was quietly met at the gate by a senior manager and to airport security. Officers not to detain him, but to escort him to a private executive lounge. 15 minutes later, Karen was summoned. When she entered the lounge and saw David sitting there with 3 airline executives, her face turned pale. The manager looked at her. Karen, meet Mr. David Carter, Executive Board Advisor, and one of our top-tier investors. She stammered. I didn't know that's the problem, David said calmly. You treat people based on who you think they are, not based on who they actually are. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her, just told the truth. If someone in economy had spoken up, would you have listened? If a black teen had asked for fresh food, would you have mocked them too? Karen tried to explain, but it didn't matter anymore. We've reviewed the footage and audio, the airline rep added. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Karen left in silence. Final note, this is bigger than one flight. David didn't take joy in her firing. He wasn't out for blood. But he knew that sometimes a message must be loud enough to create real change. Later that night, he posted a statement on his social media to anyone who's ever been disrespected for how you look, where you're from, or what seat you sit in. No, this your value doesn't come from someone else's judgment. Speak up, record it, challenge it, change it. The post went viral, and what started as a simple case of moldy food turned into a national conversation about dignity, racism, and the silent battles people still fight in places of luxury. Because in the end, respect should fly first class too. Silent racism, loud consequences, David Carter's breaking point. This wasn't the first time David Carter had felt the sting of racism dressed as politeness. Over the years, he had grown used to it, the strange looks when he walked into high-level board meetings, the awkward silence when he introduced himself as the CEO, the quiet assumption at 5-star hotels that he was just another guest trying to sneak in. He once walked into a luxury dealership wearing a tailored suit only to have a salesman toss him the keys to someone else's car, mistaking him for the valet. He was always expected to shrug it off, be graceful, BUNBOTHER. But today, sitting 30,000 feet in the air, in a seat he paid for like every other passenger, David had finally had enough. Karen, flight attendant who barely acknowledged his presence from the beginning, now hovered over the aisle again, smiling at the other first-class passengers like they were old friends. She poured fresh wine, offered extra dessert, shared jokes and laughter like it was a private club. And yet, not once did she check on David after delivering that moldy, rotting tray of food. He stayed quiet. At first, he'd been conditioned to avoid confrontation, to always take the higher road, to not be that guy, the one they'd call aggressive or hostile. But then she said it, after waiting patiently and catching her attention again. He asked calmly, I don't mean to bother you, but could I possibly get a replacement meal? This isn't safe to eat. Karen didn't even try to hide the smirk. Sir, we don't have anything else. Maybe you people are used to this kind of food. You people. The words hit David like a slap. It wasn't just rude, it was deliberate. The kind of comment that strips you of dignity and dares you to react, and worse. She said it loud enough that 2 rows heard. One man dropped his fork. A woman across the aisle widened her eyes. Silence fell again. It's a kind of silence that buzzes with discomfort, kind where everyone pretends not to have heard what they just heard. David clenched his fist under the tray table, not out of rage, but out of a lifetime of swallowed pain. The humiliation burned, but not as much as the realization. Then no one said anything, it just looked away. Except one person. An older white gentleman sitting in to see leaned forward slowly. His face was lined with age, but his voice was calm and honest. "That's not right," he whispered, just loud enough for David to hear. "You should report this when we land." David met his eyes. There was sincerity in them, not pity-respect. He nodded slowly, but what Karen didn't realize was that she hadn't just insulted another black man flying first class. She wasn't just rude to a customer, she was rude to a kingmaker. David Carter wasn't just a tech mogul. He was a silent force in the very airline she worked for. Power in silence. The man behind the curtain. What Karen couldn't possibly know was that David wasn't just sitting in first class because he could afford it. He was sitting there because he had helped design the very seat she walked past, his company. Carter Innovations had been part of a strategic partnership with the airline's corporate board just a year prior. His team had led the investment that redesigned their entire passenger experience strategy. He wasn't just a passenger, he was part owner. David opened his laptop. His hands were steady now. His anger focused. He accessed the internal corporate portal through his investor VPN, and within minutes, drafted a short but powerful email. No emotion, just facts. Subject: urgent. Onboard incident. Flight 476. Lax. Arrival 2. Alicia Monroe, Chief Operating Officer, CC. Legal and PRT Militia. I'm writing to report an unacceptable act of bias and misconduct by your first-class attendant. Let Karen, last name unknown. On Flight 476, from JFK to Lax. I've documented the incident with both photographic and audio evidence. I was served visibly spoiled food, was refused a replacement meal, and was subject to racial remarks in front of other passengers. As a major stakeholder in your customer innovation program and an advisor on diversity protocol last quarter, I believe this must be addressed before further public fallout. I expect a meeting with HR and operations staff upon landing. David Carter, CEO Carter, Innovations 10 minutes later. His phone buzzed with a reply. David, I'm horrified. We will meet you at LAX personally. This behavior is unacceptable. Expect a full debrief and corrective action. Alicia David closed the laptop. Calm again. Karen walked past him once more, avoiding his gaze like she hadn't just spoken poison minutes ago. But now, he wasn't angry. He was focused. Focused on making sure this would never happen again, not to him. Not to anyone. Foreshadowing the storm back in her galley. Karen smiled and laughed again with the other passengers. She had no idea. No idea that she had just served moldy food to the man who sat in on quarterly performance reviews. No idea that her smug remark was already being documented by corporate leadership. No idea that her casual cruelty would not only cost her a job but spark a corporate-wide policy review on unconscious bias in customer service. David looked out the window again. Clouds drifted slowly past the wing. He wasn't just flying to Los Angeles now. He was flying into a reckoning for Karen, for the airline, and for every unspoken moment of discrimination brushed under the rug, because when the plane landed, the game would change. And Karen, she was about to find out who she'd really served. The reveal, when power wears a calm face. What Karen and the airline didn't realize was that David Carter wasn't just another man in a designer suit. He wasn't just a tech billionaire who liked to fly first class. He wasn't just a black CEO with a calm voice and sharp mind. He was one of the very people who helped build the airline's future months earlier. David had sat in a closed-door meeting with the airline's top executives, whiteboards filled with ideas, graphs showing customer satisfaction, and post-pandemic strategy plans. His company, Carter Innovations, had invested heavily in reimagining the airline's digital experience, passenger safety upgrades, and loyalty programs. He didn't just know the people who ran the company. He paid their salaries, and now one of their employees was serving him moldy food and insults at 35,000 feet. Calm actions, loud consequences. David took a breath and tapped his phone open. While the plane glided smoothly over the Midwest, he connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi, opened a secure investor portal, drafted a message short, clear, and powerful. He didn't curse. Didn't yell. He used the voice of a man who owned his silence like a weapon, too. Alicia Monroe, Chief Operating Officer, CC, Internal Affairs, Legal Compliance Subject. Immediate misconduct, Flight 476, Alicia. I'm writing to alert you of an incident. Experiencing in real time, I'm currently on flight 476 from JFK to LAX. I've been served spoiled food in first class, which is alarming enough, but the greater issue is the behavior of the attendant. Karen, last name TBD, I've attached photographic evidence of the meal, as well as a brief audio recording that captures her racial remark. Maybe you people are used to this kind of food. This is not only a violation of basic service protocol, it's a direct breach of ethics and inclusion policies we implemented last fiscal quarter. Please be advised that I'll require immediate acknowledgement upon landing and that I'm treating this as a formal investor review of employee conduct and policy enforcement. David Carter, board advisor and executive investor. He destined, and then he waited, casually sipping from the only thing he'd been offered without hostility, a lukewarm glass of water. 10 minutes passed. Then his phone buzzed. Alicia Monroe. David, I am deeply sorry. That is unacceptable, and we will act on this the moment you land. Please leave this to us. You will not walk off that flight unseen. Thank you for bringing this forward directly. David read it, nodded slightly, and tucked his phone away. But what Alicia didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that David wasn't just filing a complaint. He wasn't just expecting someone to get fired or suspended. He had something bigger in mind, a legacy beyond revenge. David had grown tired of quiet conversations about diversity and inclusion that never went beyond corporate posters and staff emails. He had invested time, money, trust in an airline that promised to treat all passengers equally, and yet here he was, watching that promise dissolve with every bite of rotten chicken and every smug look from Karen. And he realized something. If this could happen to him, a man whose name was printed on the side of the company's quarterly investor packets, what was happening to those without his influence? What about the young black father flying home to his son's graduation? What about the Latina businesswoman who got downgraded without explanation? What about the elderly Muslim couple seated near the lavatory every time? This wasn't about Karen anymore. This was about every ignored passenger, every quiet humiliation, every subtle insult that went unpunished. David didn't just want a private apology. He wanted change. Mid-flight reflections, the calm before the landing, the engines hummed as the plane soared past Denver. David opened his journal, a leather-bound notebook he carried on every flight. He wasn't just documenting his thoughts now. He was outlining a plan. Mid-air accountability report, internal diversity audits, anonymous staff review, portals onboard surveillance, transparency, real-time passenger complaint, dashboard staff bias testing, and quarterly reevaluation. The time the seatbelt sign lit up again. David had outlined a 5-point policy proposal that would be reviewed by the airline's board within weeks. He wasn't just going to punish discrimination, he was going to design its downfall. Meanwhile, Karen continued smiling, laughing, walking down that aisle like she was untouchable. David didn't look at her again. He didn't need to. The landing and the storm that followed. As the aircraft finally touched down at LAX, the flight attendants gave their usual announcement. Seat belts clicked open. Overhead bins swung out. The soft chaos of landing began. David remained seated. Within 2 minutes, a team of 3 airline officials entered the plane quietly from the front. A uniformed manager, a corporate relations officer, and a head of crew compliance. They nodded. To David, Karen, still unaware, was collecting trays from row 3 when her name was called over the cabin intercom. Flight attendant Karen, last name. Please report to the front cabin. She walked up, confused, until her eyes landed on David and then the corporate manager standing beside him. Her smile faded. The officer said it plainly. You're being relieved of duty effective immediately. Please gather your belongings and accompany us for a debriefing. She stammered, trying to protest. God. But David never said a word. He simply stepped off the plane. Briefcase in hand, escorted through a side exit toward the VIP lounge. Karen was led the opposite way toward a meeting room where consequences waited. David's final statement, a new standard for the skies later that week. David published a statement on his official channels. No one should be served spoiled food. And spoiled respect at 30,000 feet? This isn't about one flight or one person. It's about a system that lets bias fly freely while pretending it doesn't exist. I've spoken to the airline's board. We're launching a full policy overhaul to ensure all passengers, regardless of race or class, receive the dignity they paid for. This isn't revenge. This is reform. The post was shared over 3 million times. The landing and the reckoning, the wheels touched down on the tarmac at Los Angeles International Airport with a smooth bump. The usual flurry of movement followed, seatbelts unfastened, overhead bins popped open, cell phones turned back on. Flight 476 had arrived. At the front of the cabin, Karen stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, smile stretched tightly across her face. "Thanks for flying with us. Have a good day." Her voice, falsely sweet, rang out as passengers shuffled past. To anyone else, she looked like a dedicated professional. But to David Carter, her smile was masked, and behind it was the same woman who had served him moldy food and a side of racial contempt. David didn't flinch. He stood, collected his leather laptop case, gave a brief nod to the passengers nearby who had watched everything in silence, and walked right past Karen without a word. But as he stepped off the jet bridge, the atmosphere changed. Waiting for him were 3 people in suits: a VIP airline manager, senior executive from HR, and a private security officer. They greeted him respectfully, quickly ushering him through a side corridor, away from the public, and into a private executive lounge sealed with frosted glass doors. Inside, the room was sleek and silent. Polished marble floors, modern furniture, cold bottled water lined up on a tray. It looked like a boardroom, but it felt like a courtroom. David sat at the head of the long table, laptop open, documents ready. He wasn't there to argue. He wasn't there to scream. He was there to correct the system. The confrontation unmasking the smile. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Karen walked in, confused and slightly rattled, clutching her handbag. Her confident posture from the flight was gone now, replaced with uncertainty. She froze as her eyes landed on David, seated calmly at the head of the table, flanked by the airline's head of staff relations and their investor relations manager. "Karen," said the airline manager, standing, "this is David Carter. You may not have realized it during the flight, but he is one of our largest private investors, as well as a board-level advisor on service innovation." Karen's face lost all its color. She looked at David, stunned. I didn't know exactly," David replied, his voice calm but sharp. "That's the problem." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold her. He didn't need to. His words carried more weight than any outburst ever could. "You treated me based on your assumption of who I was. You didn't see a customer. You saw a stereotype." He paused. Everyone in the room listened in silence. What I experienced on that flight wasn't just bad service. It was humiliation, targeted and deliberate. And the worst part? I'm certain I'm not the first person you've done this to. Just the first one with the power to call you out. Karen's lips trembled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I truly didn't mean." David raised a hand to stop her. "Don't apologize to me because you know who I am now. Apologize to the people who didn't have that privilege. The ones you mocked, ignored, or mistreated when no one was watching. Because now someone is. Judgment Day, no more second chances." The airline manager spoke next. Her voice was cold, professional, and final. "Karen, we've reviewed the complaint and the supporting evidence, including photos, passenger witness reports, and audio recordings." Karen's eyes darted around the room, desperate for a way out. "But there was none. Your conduct was a clear violation of our code of ethics, anti-discrimination policies, and customer service standards. As of this moment," she paused, "your employment with this airline is terminated, effective immediately." Karen's jaw dropped slightly. She tried again, this time more desperate than apologetic. "Please, this was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was." The HR officer stepped forward with a folder. "This isn't about who Mr. Carter is. This is about who you chose to be." Karen didn't argue anymore. She quietly gathered her things, head bowed low, and walked out of the lounge. The soft hiss of the door closing behind her was the only sound. David exhaled. He hadn't smiled once during the entire meeting. There was no pleasure in what had just happened, only justice. The statement that shook the skies later that evening. David published a statement to his professional network. He didn't name Karen. He didn't even name the airline. Didn't have to. The story was already spreading like wildfire. On a recent flight, I was served moldy food in open disrespect. It's not because of my ticket, not because of my behavior, but because of who they assumed I was. Racism doesn't always scream, sometimes. It whispers through fake smiles, spoiled meals, and selective kindness. I didn't fire someone to feel powerful. I acted to protect the powerless. If this happened to me, a man with influence, imagine what's happening to the millions who have none. This is not just about flying. This is about dignity. This is about being seen. The post went viral in under an hour. Major news outlets picked it up. Celebrities retweeted it. Activists applauded it. Airline competitors used it as an internal training case. And somewhere, in the silence of her now-empty apartment, Karen watched her name become a caution. The ripple effect, one story, 1,000 voices. The story went viral overnight. What started as a humiliating experience in the air became a catalyst for change on the ground. By the next morning, hashtags like hashtag respect is not optional, hashtag flying while black, and hashtag dignity at altitude were trending across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story within hours. CNN, BBC, The Guardian, dozens of blogs and vlogs covered it, but it wasn't the drama that caught people's attention. It was David's calm. It's a deliberate response. No yelling, no revenge. Just facts, evidence, and a truth spoken with grace and fire. Influencers applauded him for not just defending his dignity, but for using his position to challenge a system. Social justice advocates called it one of the most powerful corporate accountability stories in recent memory. People from around the world, teachers, nurses, college students, business travelers, began sharing their own stories of microaggressions. On flights, in restaurants, in boardrooms, David Carter had cracked something wide open. And now, the whole world was watching. The message heard around the world later that evening. David released a short video message on his company's website. In all social platforms, he stood in front of a simple white background. No logos, no suits. Just him come direct, sincere. His voice echoed not with anger, but truth and responsibility. We don't demand special treatment. We demand equal treatment. Whether you're in first class or the back row, respect is not optional. This wasn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been ignored, mistreated, or made to feel invisible because of what they look like. And if I had to go through this to shine a light on it, then it was worth it. The video racked up over 10 million views in 24 hours. Even airline competitors issued their own internal memos about reevaluating staff conduct and retraining protocols. Beyond the meal, the deeper wound, Karen's actions. On the surface, may have seemed smaller smirk, a cold tray, a cruel comment. But they represented something far more dangerous. They revealed how bias hides in plain sight, how discrimination often wears a uniform, and how easy it is to strip someone of their humanity without ever raising your voice. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about the idea that even with $1 million suit, an expensive seat, and a title that demands respect, black man still had to prove his worth just to be treated like a person. That was the true injustice. And David's story exposed it in a way no press release ever could. What changed, and what comes next? After the incident, the airline, under immense public pressure and David's direct advisory, announced a sweeping policy overhaul. Mandatory. It's bias and empathy training for all cabin crew, anonymous passenger complaint tracking with follow-up, guarantees a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory remarks or service discrepancies, passenger advocacy liaisons for future complaints. But David didn't stop there. He used the momentum to launch a new industry-wide initiative called Altitude for All, a program aimed at auditing airline service quality for marginalized travelers and pressuring other major carriers to commit to transparent anti-bias enforcement. He wasn't just healing his own wound. He was building a pathway for thousands more to never experience that kind of pain again, a legacy born from humiliation in the weeks that followed. David received thousands of messages, not from CEOs, not from boardrooms, but from everyday people. A young black woman who'd been ignored by hotel staff while checking in, a Sikh man who was randomly searched 5 times in a single year, an elderly Latina woman who was charged extra for luggage while her white seatmate wasn't. All of them wrote the same thing. Thank you for saying something. Thank you for not staying silent. That to David was worth more than any first-class seat. Final words for everyone watching. This wasn't a story about a spoiled meal. It was about a world where dignity still has to be earned, depending on your skin color, accent, hairstyle, or clothing. It was about showing that silence is not strength, action is. David Carter's story reminded the world that racism doesn't need to scream to exist. Sometimes it whispers through neglect, rolled eyes, through cold food and colder treatment, but it also reminded us that we have the power to speak up. And when we do with clarity.com and purpose, we don't just change our own story, change the system, and that's how one black CEO turned a racist moment into a wake-up call for an entire industry. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. And if you want more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means everything. Until next time, stay inspired, stay strong,